was little, my mom used to say this prayer over me every time I left the house. And it goes like this: Lord, watch over Leo today. Send your angels to protect him wherever he goes. I could be steps away from getting on the bus or in front of a crush at school, and my mom was going to get that blessing said over me. And contrary to what I felt at the time, it was not merely an effort to embarrass me. It was serious for her, and it wasn't until I got older that I understood why it was so important. Most kids are out of their parents' watchful eye at least 40 hours a week in school alone. In fact, typically it isn't very long, if you think about it, after a child is born that they start being away from mom and dad. By age 3 and 4, preschool begins. Children can spend anywhere between a few hours a week to all 5 days. So how do parents curb the anxiety that comes with their children being out of sight? And how do we equip the ones that we love with resiliency to survive in the real world? After all, our kids are only with us for a short time, and then they must become able to do it on their own. But remember, as God says in Joshua, you are never alone. In Romans, there are two main things I'd like to talk about today, and the first is trusting angels. In today's gospel, Jesus is beginning his ministry, and John the Baptist has just been arrested for speaking about God. Now is the time for God to take matters into his own hands through his human form, Jesus. And who does God turn to in this time of need? The most critical few years in the entire Christian faith, the turning point that the world would be talking for years to come, a story that we tell over and over. He turns to a bunch of fishermen, not a president, not a TikTok celebrity, not Jeff Bezos, not anyone that society at the time probably even noticed, but everyday, ordinary people like you and I. Why does God do this? God had the power to do it any way he liked. He doesn't create a separate God of love or God of baptism, a God of kindness. He instead says emphatically and without reservation, I've created you. I've decided to trust you. I've decided that you will be my family. In Psalms, God says we are beautiful. In Genesis, he says we are intelligent. In Romans, he says we are brave. So how do we become comfortable when our kids are out of our home and vulnerable to danger? We become comfortable in God's existing design, the design of a world where angels are everywhere in the form of everyday people. Who has been an example of this in your own life? Think of an angel that's come across your own life. I think of people like my high school math teacher, Mrs. Smith. My last 2 years of high school were a little different than my first two, and Mrs. Smith knew me enough to know that the bubbly, charismatic, positive personality had turned into an anxious, lost, and somber person. One day I left a note which was essentially a teenage cry for help under her door while she was teaching another class. I don't remember what I wrote, just that within that hour I was in an ambulance. But I remember Mrs. Smith dropping what she was doing and very calmly taking me down to the nurse. She had this presence about her I'll never forget, as if she knew this was a serious situation, that I was in danger. But she became a rock for me, who I'm sure was freaking out at the time. She sat with me waiting, and she pulled out of her pocket some candy, smiling at me as if we were just chatting. Everything was fine, as we had done a dozen times after school for extra math help. And then flashing red lights, and the memory fades. certain people and memories are like those little candle lights you put in a dark house at Christmas time. I'm sure there's a name for it, but clearly I'm blanking. These flickers of happiness that act as some sort of illumination from the dark. And as it says in the gospel, the people have seen a great light. Our job is to help light the world. And this is how we as humans take care of each other. We don't have to be part of a family or friends or even acquaintances. We are part of one risen Christ. And the second way we can curb the anxiety of our kids facing the real world is defining the concept of home base as within the self, and that self as being connected to God. Because if we instill home as a house or a place, or even those we love most, like family members, we are vulnerable. And when the winds and the rain come, we will run back to our home, only to find out that no one is there anymore, or that everybody has grown up. So being resilient is being God-reliant within the self. It's different than being self-reliant. It's understanding and genuinely believing that you are strong with an awareness that the self is created, connected, and exists to stand with a heavenly host. There are daily affirmation handouts from the children's message this morning in the back for everybody to take home today. I encourage you to take one, and from time to time, just remember who created you and why. Remember those that lit your way, and be open to lighting the way for others.